Hello, everyone. This is the July presentation of the Friends of History First Wednesday Lecture Series. I'm Ben Woodbury with the Friends of History and will serve as your host. As always, let me start with a few administrative details before today's presentation. As a reminder, all recent past and future First Wednesday online lectures are now available on our new Friends of History webpage. That's friendsofhistorynm.org. You'll find it in the chat. Just click on the lecture series link at the top of the homepage. Our monthly lectures are being provided free of charge by the Friends of History with support from the New Mexico History Museum. We do, however, accept and encourage donations. These funds will go directly to support the lecture series and, more importantly, all History Museum programs and exhibits. Should you wish to make a donation, just go to our website and click on the donate button at the top of the page. Looking forward to our August presentation, our speaker will be Stephen Post, Research Associate for New Mexico's Office of Archaeological Studies. On August 4th, Steve will discuss the New Mexico History Museum's newest exhibit, Palace Seen and Unseen, a convergence of history and archaeology, which is now open for viewing in the newly reopened Palace of Governors. Steve is a co-curator of the exhibit. If you wish to be on our mailing list to learn more about this lecture and all upcoming lectures, and more about the Friends of History, you can sign up on our webpage or email us at the address cited in the chat below. And that address reads nmhmfriendsofhistory@gmail.com. And now for today's lecture. Our main speaker is Chris Huggard, a Ph.D. graduate from the University of New Mexico and presently a professor of history and author of several books and articles. He is being joined by Terry Humble, a local historian, preservation activist, and former miner at the Santa Rita mine. Together, Chris and Terry authored the book upon which today's talk is based. It's entitled Santa Rita del Cobre, a copper mining community in New Mexico, published by the Univ Press of Colorado. The book, it received the 2012 Howard Western University Award, a separate 2012 Southwest Book Award, and the 2013 Clark C. Spence Award for Best Book in Mining History. Following the presentation, Chris and Terry will answer any questions you may have. The questions and comments can be posted at any time in the YouTube and our Facebook chat rooms, both during and after the presentation. Upon completion of today's event, the entire presentation will be posted on the Friends of History webpage, as well as on the History Museum's YouTube and Facebook pages. And now we welcome Chris Huggard and Terry Humble. Chris?
Hello, everyone. Hi, Terry. It's good to see you again, brother.
Good to see you, Chris.
Well, folks, Terry and I go back about 30 years, and as our story goes, Terry and I met kind of by accident. What had happened was I was a graduate student at the University of New Mexico in the history department, and I knew I was going to do a dissertation on mining and mostly the environmental impact. And I was given a little tip by my major professor when I thought I would do the Kelly Magdalena mines. He said, and I'll never forget, he was Gerald Nash, the late Gerald Nash. He says, "Now, Chris," he said, "you should think about going to Grant County, New Mexico. There's a giant mine down there." And believe it or not, I did not know about the Chino mine, where the town of Santa Rita had been. And I went to New Mexico, down to Silver area, Silver City. And I was directed by some people to Terry. And so that's how Terry and I met. And what happened was Terry, of course, was working for the mine as a diesel mechanic and the head of the truck shop, working on these giant 250-ton trucks. It ends up Terry had been collecting photographs and historical documents for nearly 50 years. And I suddenly had a really good friend in him, both in terms of our passion for the history of mining, and in particular Santa Rita, the town, and the Chino mine, but also because of the fact that we were both very interested in this particular story. And so that for us, and there's a lot of detail on how we met and how we did the book in the book itself. And so I won't go into that a lot, just to say that it was a wonderful association that's now been going on for over 30 years. What I'd like to do today in narrating basically 2 centuries of copper mining at Santa Rita is to give basically a general overview. Just be aware that if you do get the book or you have a chance to check out the book somewhere, you'll get a lot more detail. And that detail will cover from basically 1800 until the 1970s and even a little bit later, even though the town of Santa Rita, of course, no longer exists. So in essence, that's what this story is about. It's a long narrative covering 200 years. There are some main themes in the book, of course, the themes of mining itself. And mining changes over time, both in terms of who was doing it, from literally native peoples, mainly the Apaches and others, literally taking raw copper out of the side of the mountain and trade, and it was found as in trade items as far as Alaska and elsewhere, to more modern types of mining where they dug this raw native copper and then began to smelt it, to modern high technology techniques of the late 19th century. And then, of course, since then, beginning in 1910, with the porphyry mining of very low-grade ore that could be mined because of even newer technologies. So those technologies over time are covered in this volume. Another thing is the different people who lived in the community over time. Their story is told, and I'll touch on that some as well. We also talk about the evolution of how this affects the environment. That is something that we cover as well. And then, of course, it goes without saying, though the famous Salt of the Earth strike is very famous and involved the Empire Zinc mine, it was really the workers at Chino mines that worked for Kennecott Copper Corporation that really led that strike. And of course, they made great gains for workers at the mine, especially in the post-World War II period. And so we'll cover a little bit of that today, and there's great detail on that in the book as well. If there's one theme that really holds this study together, it's place. It is a place that we look at that experiences different things, with the core of the story being the extraction of copper over 200 years. And so that place is really what ties it all together with these larger themes of mining technology, community, environmental impact, labor, and then of course larger historical themes that play a role in that, from the Atlantic trade system going back to the colonial period, to the impact of the emergence of electricity and the great needs for copper. That also involved auto industry. And then of course, the impact of modern phenomena like World War II and modern ideas about how workers' rights should be taken care of in the process of creating untold amounts of wealth. At the peak, in fact, of the mine, in 1 year, at the peak, The mine had a profit of $444 million. That's in 1 year. And so that tells you about the vast wealth that's produced here. And in the end, quite frankly, what it does is it creates over time what we call a working middle class, people that are able to afford their own homes in the post-World War II period, people who were able to tap into some of the profits that were created at that time principally by the Kennecott Copper Corporation. In the bigger picture of the state of New Mexico, we all, of course, celebrate the long history of Native peoples in New Mexico, especially in the north. We think of the Hispanic culture from Spanish and Mexican and other Hispanic cultures, and then the influx of Anglos and the mixing of those cultures. And we think of Santa Fe and we think of Taos and Albuquerque. But what people don't know much about in terms of New Mexico history, it is Grant County. And despite the fact that northern New Mexico is far more famous, Grant County has always been the wealthiest county. And it's not just because of the copper, because they had all kinds of other minerals that were mined over a long period of time. The longest standing perpetuation of that wealth, of course, is this single mine, this giant open pit called the Chino mine. And then the last thing I'll say in this little preliminary is you look at this first slide that shows the cover of our book. You see some of the comments here made by reviewers, and then the list of awards we were so grateful to receive is in this particular story of Santa Rita, is that there was also a town there. The town was not always permanent. It started first with the Spanish. The Apaches, of course, ran them off, and then the Mexicans off for some decades during the 19th century. After the Civil War, by the early 1870s, the town of Santa Rita was in place, but it still was under threat of Apache attack, being in the center of the Chiricahua Apache homeland. Eventually, after Indian removal and the creation of the reservation systems, we do have a permanent town. And eventually it would have several thousand people. And the peak, I think they had over 2,500 workers just at this mine. The irony, of course, is with the growth of the pit, you can kind of see here this 1942 picture I'm outlining. There's what's left of the town. You can see the pit growing here kind of on the northwest and then over here. Eventually, by 1970, the pit grows so much there no longer is a town called Santa Rita, which, of course, is Terry's hometown. He was born in the hospital there. And one of the fascinating parts of this story is that what there we see in this particular picture in 1942 is now space. Literally, the pit is so big. And consequently, Harrison Schmitt, the former US Senator and astronaut, Ted Ariano, and some others started a society for people born in space. And for some years, up through the early 2000s, they would meet and celebrate their lost town. And so, Terry, you were born in space, and but not the kind of space we all think of. So that's the introduction to the book. Obviously, we're very grateful, and we thank the Friends of History of the Museum of New Mexico Foundation for inviting us and for giving us this opportunity to share about this wonderful place and story. I also want to thank my good friend Bob Spoody for connecting us with the Friends. Here's the table of contents. You can go online and check that out. But basically, we go from the early period, into, which is really the first 3/4 of the 19th century. We then look at what we call the lode mining era, frontier mining. Then the open pit era. Then chapter 4, we look at the actual community. That's probably Terry's favorite chapter, and it really talks about the people themselves and the rich cultures of the Mexicans and Mexican Americans and Anglo Americans who worked together. For most of the history at the Chino mine, 65% or so of all the workers were of Mexican American heritage. The last chapter, chapter 5 here, really looks at the post-World War II period and the emergence of this corporate giant technology mining. And then we look at the end about at the environmental impact involving air and water and land. This map gives you a sense of where it is. This is the Arizona-New Mexico line, the border down here with Chihuahua, Mexico. Here's Las Cruces, El Paso, and you can see the Rio Grande here in this stylized map. Here's Santa Rita. It's just a little bit northeast of Silver City. Pinos Altos, the old gold mining town. Georgetown, another mining town, mainly silver. And here's Deming. So that gives you a sense of the place. What first attracted people that were interested in mining and extracting copper was this native copper. There were tons and tons of what is really raw copper. And really, even before any Euro-Americans showed up, the Native Americans took this raw copper and pounded it into pendants and bells and other things. And so it was a well-known site with this extraordinary outcrop of native copper that was traded as far as the Atlantic coast, central Mexico, and Alaska. It was, in fact, an Apache man who led this man, Lieutenant Colonel Jose Manuel Carrasco, who had been actually fighting Native Americans in New Spain out of in the northern part of what will be Mexico for some time. And after he retired from the Spanish military, he decided he was going to make his fortune in copper. This is a depiction by Carl Hawk of that event when an Apache man showed him the native copper. Couple really interesting points about this. Up here is this little monolithic piece of stone that still is there. It's known as the Kneeling Nun, and is really an iconic monument, a natural monument that has all kinds of interesting myths surrounding it, and is seen as kind of the nun who's overseen the community throughout its history. The other thing, of course, here is that the Apache man is showing him the copper. He's not pointing to it because Apaches would not have pointed. So I thought that was a really interesting point that Carl Hawk, the artist, had made clear in this particular depiction. In the end, by 1803, Carrasco had made the claims through Spanish law to begin to mine here. And the Spanish, of course, with Carrasco kind of doing some of the work, it was probably others that were doing it. And then it was, of course, picked up later by a man named Elguea, who really began to mine it. And in the end, in the early years, they basically used long, what we would call crowbars and what they called chicken ladders. And they dug these very narrow tunnels. And literally, sometimes they were so narrow, men had to go in the tunnel walking down with their arms above them. That would have been, anyone with claustrophobia wouldn't have been able to do that. In that era, they were literally just taking out that raw copper. It was before there was any blasting, major blasting, or any kind of crushing or concentrating the ore. This was just the raw copper at that time. Sometime probably in the late 1820s, the Mexicans, who had just, of course, acquired this territory and their independence from Spain, created this fort here that you see depicted. It's a triangular fort there that was is shown here in a drawing that we got from the National Archives that was part of the Bartlett expedition that was down there to begin to survey that area to add the Gadsden Purchase in 1853. And so there was some activity there at that time. It was actually at the height in the early 1850s of the Apaches keeping anyone out of there. And of course, after 1848, it was American. And The Americans, of course, had acquired this territory with the Mexican-American War, 1846 to 48. This was then temporarily the headquarters for that surveying crew, and then it was abandoned for a few more years. And then finally, during the Civil War, it was initially controlled by the Union, and then the Confederates came in. They used the copper actually for making bullets of all things because of the fact that lead was hard to get. But then not much really went on there. There were a few people digging deep into the ground. And it would then be in the 1870s that we begin to see what we call lode mining. It's really underground mining where most of the raw copper had played out, though they would always, and they even still today to this day, occasionally run into a sheet of that native copper. That was mostly already mined out. And now they had to use more intrusive extractive methods like blasting, and this is what we see here. This is men using hammers to hammer out holes. They would put dynamite in it, and then they blast it, and then the next day they muck that out, and that ore then would be taken to crushers and concentrators, and basically had to be smelted. So you have multiple processes that took place to get to the copper. This area was very much targeted during this time frame by big corporate interests, the Rockefeller interests. General Electric was very interested. And of course, Rockefeller, John D. Rockefeller Jr. had been interested in investing in GE, as had J.P. Morgan. And so the real big giants were there. In the meantime, there were other individuals, mostly out of the East and Boston. J.P. Whitney acquired many of these mines. And in fact, one of the main mines was named Romero for one of the Mexican superintendents going way back. So the Romero works were the most famous. And so ultimately what we see is this deep underground mining taking place. However, what happened in this era was that the type of ore that they had, and I want to say, if my memory is correct, it was an oxide ore, was really hard to concentrate. And that's just a process in which you crush a material, you then concentrate it, so that you have as much of the actual mineral in the concentrate as possible, and then that would be sent to a smelter. They would superheat it and create nearly pure copper. The problem was these ores were really hard to process, and it became very expensive. So a lot of the big shots kind of passed on this, and this fellow J.P. Whitney out of Boston kind of ran the mines. And in fact, by the end of the 19th century, the Santa Rita Copper and Iron Company and then the Santa Rita Mining Company that was actually had some association with the Rockefellers and J.P. Whitney, they just didn't feel like they could make a real good profit off these mines. And in the end, it kind of stalled, even though by the time the open pit era starts with the Chino Copper Company in 1909, they had discovered what's called porphyry copper, porphyry ore. And what this is a really basically an ore where there's microscopic amounts of copper in it. And up to that time, they really didn't, beginning in about 1905-06 up in Utah, the famous Bingham mine that was started by Daniel Jackling in the Kennecott interests and the Guggenheim interests, another giant corporate interest out of the East. They began to realize that though the native copper was played out for the most part, and the lode ores were too hard to deal with, that this porphyry ore could be a very, very positive corporate investment. And the man who really becomes kind of the hero in this story, his name is John Sully. John Sully had been, he was an engineer. He was trained, I think, out of MIT. He had been working for Hermosa Copper Company and GE Interest and some others. And he was asked by GE executives to do an examination of this ore body, which is massive. And he did his examinations, and he predicted that there could be millions. I think his initial prediction, Terry, was like 15 million. And we now know that's just chicken feed, because in single years they were profiting over 400 million in different periods in the 20th century. And so ultimately this became something way beyond even Sully's imagination. Now you can't see this, the words in here really well, but what you see here is in 1916, this is a survey that was done of the ore body. And what you see here are these little dots that's the town of Santa Rita, and here's part of the town here. And what they had done is they'd mapped out these ore bodies. This is the north ore body. This is the south ore body. And these were going to be the areas that they would target. And unlike when you do lode mining, where you create a deep shaft and go down and blow up a vein of ore, you literally just blow up everything. And then they process all of that material. They would send it through crushers. They then, once it was crushed, it would be put in a concentrator. The concentrator would basically settle out the mineral within the ore that's obviously very high in waste material that they call gangue. And as they get rid of that gangue, that concentrate usually is around 60% copper. It then would be sent to a smelter. And what happened was that once they began, the Chino Copper Company, under the leadership of John Sully, began to dig up these massive amounts of ore. And by the way, they would sometimes blast millions of pounds, hundreds of thousands of tons of ore in a single blast. They would then go with these shovels and then shovel it. Initially, they were shoveling it onto ore cars, and they put over 50 miles of railroads just in the mine, 50 miles of railroad lines. That tells you the massiveness of the mine. This is 1917, and this shows the ownership of the land of the Chino Copper Company. Not only did they own the ore body, which was huge, and here's the town would have been here, but they also bought up all this other land that's outlined here, because here at Hurley, they put their concentration. The crushers were in different places, but there were some crushers, concentrators, and then of course the smelter that they put in beginning in 1910. And all of this here was, they bought this land for waste materials. And over here, they bought this land along Lampright Draw for water rights. So that in addition to creating this massive open pit mine that is eating away at the town, creating thousands of jobs, good paying jobs, although it was a closed town at this time, a company town, and I'll talk a bit about that here in a bit. You also have the crushing, concentrating, and smelting complex that requires massive amounts of land for dumping the tailings, but also massive amounts of land that would be needed to use the water rights, because it took millions of gallons of water to process all of this ore. And of course, water would continue to be important all the way to the present with the newest technologies. So from really, and by the way, in 1909, the first stock was sold for $5 per. By 1917, that stock had jumped up to about $65 per stock. and they were making $10 million a year in the height of World War I. So Solly's prediction of 15 million was surpassed within the first 10 years by far, and this became a cash cow. It's interesting, it's also part of a larger phenomena of porphyry open pit mines that were opened up across the American West, the Bingham Mine, Morenci, Clifton, Ajo, and of course Chino were in the American West. And then they opened up some down in Peru and Chile, Toquepala, the Sewell Mine, Chuquicamata, and others. And they were all, most of them were owned by the Kennecott Copper Corporation, which was created in 1915. It became the largest copper corporation in the world. It was largely under the control of the famous engineer Daniel Jackling, especially prior to World War II, when it was engineers and mining men who controlled these corporations, prior to the post-World War II era, when mostly lawyers became the CEOs. And in that era, of course, there was all kinds of new technology that allowed for them to be able to mine these very low-grade porphyry ores. Couple things, some stats. By 1920, the United States was producing over 60% of all the world's copper. In fact, in the 20s, the US tried to create a cartel in competition with international copper producers. That never really panned out very well. I think in large part because corporations, independent corporations, often want to act independently of each other, like Kennecott, Phelps Dodge, and other companies. And then, of course, they were also initially, the smelting was actually done by the ASARCO, American Smelting and Refining Company, which was owned by the Guggenheims. And so I actually got the date wrong. The smelter was first put in at Hurley a little bit after 1910. Terry, do you remember the exact date? When was the first smelter put in? Was that in the 20s?
1939, Chris.
1939. Okay, I had forgotten that. So before 39, please correct that in your minds. It was not 1910 was when they began to created the crushers in the concentration at Hurley. They didn't bring in the first smelter till 39 because they were sending the concentrate to El Paso at the ASARCO smelter there. And then in 39, they built the first furnace, and then they improved it over time at Hurley until it was finally ended in 2007. But one of the things to keep in mind, these corporations didn't just buy the mine, they had to buy land for waste, but also for water rights. And so they had massive amounts of land, and this is corporate mining, and they were producing untold amounts of profits that obviously made their way into the local economy, and of course created thousands of jobs over time. Among the most common workers there were actually Mexican Americans. Initially it was Mexicans. Within a generation or so, they were Mexican Americans, they were American citizens. In this rare photo here that we were able to get from Guillermo Martinez, here's a track gang. They were exclusively Mexican American, and they were the ones who were building these 50 miles of railroads to rail in the railroad cars that they would fill with the ore before the modern trucks were brought in. They were also implementing steam shovels, these massive steam shovels that were also manned. These were usually manned by skilled workers who were in unions. And in those early years, the skilled jobs were exclusively in the hands of Anglo workers, and the unskilled, or they were really skilled, but they were just paid less, were of the Hispanic, the Mexican Americans. And of course, this became a concern over time as the mine grew and the community continued. there was an interest among obviously the Mexican American workers that they should get paid better. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. This is a fascinating part of a panoramic view of Santa Rita in 1916. This is just one of maybe 5 panels of this particular photo that was allowed to be published in the book by the Silver City Museum, which owns it. Here you see what's called the Devil's Backbone. And in these early years, prior to World War II, it was a segregated area. In this side, you had what they called Mexican Town. Over here was just Santa Rita. Here you can see there's one of the housing units that they had a lot of the Anglo workers. These workers, here's one of the churches and some of the businesses down here. These workers over here, they basically were allowed to use a lot. They built their home. I think they had to pay 50 cents a month. Over here and over here, those homes were built and they were rented for a little bit more by the Anglo workers in those early years. But this gives us a real picture of the terrain, but also you can see over here where the pit is growing and now they're starting to come down here. And what was here at one time as part of the town is now gone. And so the town is growing. There's a fascinating story, of course, of the people, the community. It was a mixed heritage community of Anglo-Americans and, of course, Mexican-Americans. And, of course, they had their Boy Scout troops, the schools. You have labor leaders like the famous Joe T. Morales here. They had their bands. Here's another rare picture that Richard Luna shared with us. Here in this picture, you see the management officers there. And I believe this was in Hurley. Right here, this fellow here, I'm circling, that is John Sully, who was the mastermind, who was the head of it until 1933. Here in a later era, you can see big management that is planning the expansion of the open pit. And of course, I'll show you a picture of the big labor folks later. By World War II in the 1950s and 60s, the technology got bigger and bigger. They switched from railroad to using these giant trucks, initially 25 ton. I think this one's about 125 ton. Now, Terry, they're up to what, 400 ton?
No, just 300.
300 ton. We've been to some places where they're 400 ton. Those 300 ton, to give you an idea how big a 300 ton truck is, you can have a dinner party for about 60 people in the bed of the truck. So these are massive pieces of equipment. They can move massive amounts of material. In fact, I think each 300 ton truck at one time, each full truck was worth about $2,000. That may be even higher now, Terry, with the current price of copper. Here we see the smelter. Of course, it came in 39, and then was, you see later on, I think it was like around 49, they added another furnace, and so they had 2 smokestacks. These giant shovels that are on Caterpillar tracks precluded the need for the rail for the previous steam-driven shovels. And I think one of these giant shovels, I don't know, they're so huge. You can see people here. You could have probably a dinner party for about 20 people just in that bucket, to give you an idea of the massive technology. To give you an idea, this isn't quite a 300 ton truck, but I know at one time a single tire on a 300 ton truck was $25,000, and they're 3 stories high. These trucks are so big in the early years, just a normal everyday half-ton truck, if they did not have in the early years, they didn't have a big tall pole, with a flag. And there were a couple incidents where these trucks literally hit and overran a truck and killed a couple guys because they couldn't see them. That's how big they were. Although the safety became a huge factor, and that's another thing that's in the book I won't talk much about, but a lot more people were injured, harmed, and killed in the early years. And by the time of this modern big technology, they rarely had any deaths at the mines. So extraordinary in terms of safety. Here by 1942, in World War II era, you can see the pits growing on all sides of the town that is being eaten away. And of course, will eventually be eaten completely away, so that all there is a pit now. And it's famously known as the town in space. And Terry himself was born in the hospital in Santa Rita that today is where space is. So they famously started that society for people born in space, which is a fascinating part of that story. Another story, of course, that's a rich part of the story of Grant County is the history of labor in the post-World War II period. By the end of the 1940s, the Chino mine laborers really dominated the International Union of Mine Mill and Smelter Workers, also known as Mine Mill. Here are some of the famous folks. Here's Juan Chacon, Juan and his wife, Virginia. Here's Clinton Jinks, who really came there and started the mine mill. Local 890 is what it became known as. Cipriano Montoya and some others are here that really became the leaders in fighting for not only the rights of all the workers to get good pay and lines of promotion and to be able to have collective bargaining, but it also became a way for everyone to benefit in the profits in a fairer way as time went on. And we talked very in depth about this story. The only thing I'll say about this is the famous Salt of the Earth strike of 1950 to 52 was against the Empire Zinc Company. But what a lot of people don't realize is Juan Chacon, this fella here, and Joti Morales, who's not in this, who both, of course, became famous for the Salt of the Earth film that was done. It's the only film ever banned as communist. Quite frankly, it wasn't communist at all. I think they might have been more upset about the pro-women's story in that particular film. If you haven't seen it, the Salt of the Earth film is worth seeing. It was against Empire Zinc, but it was really the Chino stewards in Mine Mill that led that strike. And so they had really the power of being part of a massive corporation, the #1 copper corporation in the world, Kennecott Copper. And the Kennecott Copper Corporation had become quite friendly to the workers and was willing to set the pattern for good wages. And so the Salt of the Earth strike really wasn't against Kennecott, because Kennecott actually was listening to the workers. It was mostly Empire Zinc. So that part of the story is told in our book as well. Well, and to end in this a brief presentation, this is a more recent photo of the pit, and you can see how massive it got. And it's even bigger now. This was 13 years ago. I took this picture, and if you get a chance, you can drive by that on the highway. There's a nice wayside area there that gives some of the history. You can see this view of the pit. That truck there is a 300-ton truck that's about 3 stories high, to give you a sense of some perspective. At this point, the mine was over 1,500 feet deep and 1.5 miles wide. So it gives you an idea of the massiveness of it. And of course, they're still producing hundreds of millions of dollars a year in profits there, though it isn't happening every year. And COVID did, of course, slow things down. It does give you a sense of the untold amount of wealth that has been extracted from the hillsides here in Grant County, New Mexico. And the last slide for this presentation is the 2007 demolition of the 2 massive smokestacks at the smelter in Hurley. It really was the end of an era in which they no longer were going to smelt the concentrates, because They had created a new technology. They had been precipitating copper here since the 1920s, maybe even the late 1910s, in fact, in which they would take some of the ore that was low grade, they'd dump it in a vat with various different chemicals, and that would precipitate out the copper. Well, by the 1950s, but especially in the 60s, maybe even a little before that, they invented what was called solvent extraction electrowinning. It's called SXEW. And what that involves is literally all they do is blast the material, pile it up, and then they run sprinklers over it with sulfuric materials and other materials in it. And that water then precipitates the copper out of the crushed materials. And that water is collected in a plant, excuse me. And then they put these cathodes, which start at 16 pounds or so, and that may vary now from when I was looking at it a while back. And that 16-pound cathode, just by running in that water, they called it impregnated water, would collect copper in the liquid substance and create a 400-pound ingot. And it didn't require smelting. It didn't require any concentrating. And they bypassed some very expensive processing. And that is what has allowed the Chino mine to continue, even though the town of Santa Rita no longer exists. And so, in a nutshell, in a brief presentation, you get this story over 200 years in which you see these different cultures of people coming together, using modern technologies as they advance over time to create untold amounts of copper and wealth, both for the corporations like Chino and Kennecott, and later Phelps Dodge, and today Freeport-McMoRan, but also, especially after World War II, when the workers began to, the bulk of the workers had opportunities. In the end, you create what was created in Grant County was what we like to call a working middle class, so that most people that worked there, they could afford to buy a home. They could afford to send their kids to college. The company helped to subsidize college tuition and created hospitals and created other kinds of things in the community outside of the company town experience, so that the profits from these natural mineral resources were shared by the whole of the community. And the last thing I'd say is New Mexico is an extraordinary state. Those of us who are not from there, we love New Mexico for its multicultural traditions, its rich histories that go back thousands of years with the Pueblo people and other native peoples. With the influx of the Spanish and the Mexicans, we get the Hispanic influence. And then, of course, the Anglos came in to create this multicultural society. But most of us, when we think of New Mexico, we think of Taos and Santa Fe and Albuquerque and Acoma. What we hope with our book we've been able to do is not only tell a story that involved massive technologies to create copper to help to fuel modern society, but it also became an important part of the New Mexico story. And one of the things I always love about that area is, though people are affluent, they do very well there. There's a lot of friendship across the Hispanic and Anglo cultures. Most people know both languages, or at least some of their non-native language. The people are incredibly friendly there. And so this is a place that has has made a major contribution to the history of New Mexico. And it's a place that is still creating untold amounts of wealth. And it also is a place that has other attractions that I certainly would encourage any of you that haven't been to southwestern New Mexico to take the opportunity to go there. So with that, we'd love to entertain any questions.
So our first question is, will the mine last forever? And if not, who is going to fill in the hole?
Well, Terry, why don't you answer the part about will it last forever, and then I'll answer the part about will they fill in the hole.
Okay. At the present, they've probably got enough copper to last another 20 years. And in the meantime, technology is going to improve enough that it could go 40 or 60 years. And the grandfather clause in the law says they don't have to fill it in. Tell them why, Chris.
Well, I would add to that is when John Sully in 1906 or so did his report, he predicted like 30 years, that the mine would last 30 years. Here we are 110 years later, 115 years later, and it's still going. And that's a tribute to technology, engineering, and the ability to be able to extract such minute amounts of copper from this material. In terms of filling up the pit, it basically is an impossible task, because you basically, first of all, have to destroy other mountains to fill it up. Because remember, a lot of that material has been made into copper and it's long gone. Other material has been made into tailings. And so consequently, filling up the pit itself is really pretty much an impossibility. The other part of this, though, that is very important is that it does have the potential to produce water pollution. When they ended the smelting, that ended the air pollution with the exception of some dust. So that part was taken care of. So what they do to minimize the water pollution is they have these massive areas on top of the mounds. I don't have a picture here, but there are some in the book, mounds of ore that they funnel this, precipitate that water through it. They initially in the early years, they lined it with clay. That did not hold all of the material. So they now have these massive, you can imagine the size of these things, plastics that they put down first. Here's the thing, that isn't foolproof, and there will potentially be some water pollution. On the other hand, the research shows that just normal mineralization of the precipitation of minerals in the water systems create a certain amount of iron and other things in water anyway. But the bottom line is, in terms of the question about the pit, it just, first of all, it would be, you couldn't do it in terms of the material to fill it, and the cost would be prohibitive. But there are provisions, regulations, and they even have funds that they create into the tune of tens of millions of dollars that they have to commit to mitigating water pollution. And so that is really the reality of it.
So, Chris, you've been so thorough in your discussion. I had a number of additional questions to kind of
Yes, sir.
moving, but you've successfully, I think, addressed all of them in varying degrees. I am curious. I know that this was a close partnership between the two of you, and I'm wondering if you might share what you felt were between each of you or both of you were the most satisfying experiences in this collaborative effort.
Terry's wife, Meech's cooking. I ended up spending about 6 weeks total living with the Humbles. And Meecha, she's Mexican. She's now American citizen, of course. She cooks the best food I've ever eaten. But in seriousness about the project, why don't you answer that first, Terry, and then I'll follow you.
Well,
The most satisfying part.
it was just the camaraderie with you, Chris, and the fact that I could share these tons of material that I had collected. So,
Well, yeah, I agree completely. And what you see there is Terry's office. We sat in that office day after day, poring over photographs, poring over materials, discussing how we wanted to present it. And even the captions for the photos was extensive amount of work. And we just clicked. Terry had a kind of local knowledge that I never could have even come close to. Terry was born in Santa Rita. Terry loved his town. Terry learned from a very young age that his town wasn't going to be there forever. So he began to collect all the information he could, company records, school records, hospital records, photographs. We have over 100 illustrations. Most are from Terry. We could not have done it with Terry collecting all that. But here's my part of it. I am a trained academic historian. Most trained academic historians are taught that you write your own book. You don't include other people. But that is not how I viewed it. And the other thing is, Terry had spent many more years on the history of his own town. And when I approached Terry to do this book, I knew we were going to do it together because it would make it a special book because of his expertise, my skill and expertise. When you combine the two and then all these resources, it would have been prohibitive cost-wise to be able to use this many photos if they had been owned by different repositories. And though we did generously get Silver City Museum, I think, gave their photos for free. We had a few we had to pay for. If we had to pay for all of them, we could not have done it. And so it was a truly collaborative effort. And in the end, I would end with this. Just look at the book. It is an 8x11 book. That is very unusual. And in fact, I had promoted the idea of that with the University Press of Colorado. They didn't kind of seem to like that. And then when I got the proofs, and I got them and I opened it up and put it on the kitchen table, my wife said, Kate Pritchett, she said, wow, this is going to be a coffee table book. And of course I cringed, but I was also happy because I knew that these amazing illustrations could be highlighted in a way you're not going to get in a normal book. So that's how we would answer that. Thank you, Ben.
Yeah, well, that's a fascinating story in and of itself, and clearly a very successful collaboration. Thank you. We have another question. When was the Tyrone mine opened, and what is its relationship with the Chino mine?
Well, it's a totally separate company. It was the Phelps Dodge corporation that started Tyrone. I actually did a piece on Tyrone. It's in the Journal of the West. And I want to say it's like 1997 or sometime. I go into great detail about that. And so there were two separate companies. Tyrone, of course, was Phelps Dodge. And they created a company town. It really began to flourish. They created this extraordinary town. They hired a New York City architect to design the first Tyrone. And then, of course, it would be later Phelps Dodge. Once the underground mines kind of played out, they would then start the pit there. And so that was completely different company, but with the similar types of technologies, especially once they started doing the pit. Now the pit's a lot smaller. Terry, you have something to add to that?
well, it's just the fact that when Phelps Dodge took over the Chino mine at Santa Rita, of course, they became synonymous from the same owner, and they are both owned at present by Freeport McMoran. And yes, the Tyrone mine is slightly smaller than the Chino mine.
And Phelps Dodge they acquired Chino in 1983. Wasn't that it?
1987.
87, after Ohio had it briefly.
Yes.
And now, of course, Tyrone is a retirement community.
I see. Okay.
If you all know about Ajo, would have been very similar. I think Ajo still has part of their original town, and it would have been somewhat like that. But Tyrone was some kind of fabulous town based on some of the most modern architecture of the early 20th century.
Wonderful. So I don't, Kathleen, Chris, any further questions at this point?
Nope, no questions.
I'm sorry, Chris?
No questions.
Okay, thank you. So here's an opportunity, Chris and Terry, to any last minute comments before we begin to sign off.
Terry, why don't you say something and then I'll top it off.
Well, I just wanted to thank Ben and Chris for letting us have the opportunity to share what little knowledge we have.
Thank you.
Terry's always very humble, you guys. And I just want to reiterate how, what a wonderful relationship it's been to work with you, Terry. Love you, buddy.
So on behalf of the New Mexico History Museum, and particularly the Friends of History, I do want to thank you both for giving us your time and sharing with us with this fantastic, just fascinating story. And this is for someone who had no prior background in this particular field. I want to thank you for the history, focusing on not only the founding, but the growth, development, and disappearance into space of Santa Rita and Rita. It is an exception, in my view, an exceptional historical study of the town and of the copper mine, of which the town was such an intimate part. I saw through the eyes of the Santa Rita's inhabitants and the lives they led, through its over 200-year history, the story as a notable snapshot of open pit mining in southwest New Mexico and all its social, cultural, and environmental complexity. Terry, I want to personally thank you for the critical role you played in co-authoring the book and drawing on your remarkable archive of historical materials, which I think is behind you, and your extensive personal knowledge of the mine, the town and its people, and leveraging your own personal experiences as a resident of Santa Rita since childhood and as an employee of the mine throughout your adult life. We really want to thank you again and wish you both every success. Thank you.
Thank you.